Welcome back to the Church Law Podcast. I'm Erika Cole, the church attorney, and I'm so excited to have you join us as we dive into some of the top legal and tax issues facing churches and ministries. Today, we're talking about taking your top legal and tax questions. We are going into the listener question bag again. And I have a very special guest with me today, someone who's been instrumental in equipping church leaders with the knowledge they need to navigate legal and tax matters effectively. Joining me is Matthew Branaugh. He is an attorney and editor who has served with Church Law and Tax since 2008. He leads an award-winning team of editors and designers with the planning, creation, and publishing of Church Law and Tax, which has recently joined with Gloo. His work has been invaluable in providing churches with guidance on the complex issues they face. And he's joined me on past episodes, which we will drop in the show notes as we have answered listener questions in the past. So today we are responding to your most recent questions. So keep them coming. Matthew, welcome back to the Church Law Podcast.
Thank you, Erika. It's really great to be here. And it's really just a privilege for me not only to get the chance to interact with you and your listeners, but just to continue to see you do so well as far as the podcast and everything that you've worked towards here over the last few years to build it.
Well, you and Church Law and Tax, now a part of Gloo, have been instrumental in that. And before we jump into the questions, would you mind sharing a little bit about your work with Gloo and tell us about how things have been going so far?
Yes, absolutely. So Church Law and Tax is, and some of your listeners may know this, some may not, but Church Law and Tax has been around since the early 1980s. So it's got 40 plus years of track record now established in this area of legal and tax and finance issues for churches and pastors. And in 2024, Church Law and Tax was sold to Gloo, which is a Colorado-based company that's building some really exciting tools and platforms that are designed to really help equip, energize, and educate churches and church leaders and church-serving organizations all over the country. And so how Gloo sort of looks at Church Law and Tax is one of those platforms that serves churches and church leaders well, and any way that it can sort of put this kind of material into a larger scope of churches and church leaders, that's a win. And so that's what Gloo sees in Church Law and Tax. That's why it purchased us about almost a year ago now. And we're ecstatic. It's been a great experience so far. It's a great culture, a great team. And along with it, Gloo is really taking the lead on the whole conversation related to AI and how AI can be used and shaped for good purposes, not just bad purposes, as we sometimes hear in news coverage and elsewhere, but in ways that can be redemptive and can help churches, help people to thrive and flourish in their relationships with God. So glad to be a part of that team and excited about what the future holds for Church Law and Tax as a part of Gloo.
Well, I love it. And I just want to say to listeners, again, you'll see this in the show notes, but Gloo is spelled Gloo in case you're checking that out.
That's right.
So
yes.
I'm going to hop into the discussion questions. Thank you, listeners, for sending your questions our way. We're happy to be able to answer them. And so we're going to get started. Here is question number one, Matt. And so I'll ask the question and we can kind of go back and forth on our responses. And here's question one. Should we do background checks for all volunteers or just those who work with children? I love this listener question. I've gotten this question a few times. So I'd love to hear your response. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah. Erika, like you, I love this question and it's an important one. And the reason it's so important, and I know you've shared this before on your show, and we talk about it a lot at Church Law and Tax, but really, one of the top reasons churches end up in court is related to an abuse allegation, unfortunately. And so this is the topic that, if your listeners do nothing else coming out of this episode but say we got to get better at what we're doing with child protection and abuse awareness. That is a significant win. So this question speaks right to that, and I'm really glad for the opportunity to answer it. I think one thing, just as a quick disclaimer, we get this question a lot. We should define children in this question, because oftentimes we think of the nursery and we think of preschoolers, elementary age, but really this is a continuum that goes all the way up until someone turns 18. So it's all of your junior high and high school related ministries too. So I know sometimes that gets a little bit lost in that question. I just want to define that we're talking about everyone from 0 to 18 in this scenario. So, I mean, the broad answer is, as a standard best practice, every church should fully screen every volunteer and staff member who's working with children and youth. And that would include criminal background checks that run local, state, and federal databases. Now, that can be costly, but it's crucial and probably should be run at least every 2 years. There is a free sex offender database at the federal level that your listeners would be likely interested in, and we can include it in the show notes, but it's nsopw.org. And that is one way to try and move the process along, but you're going to want to likely pay for a service that can run the local, state, and federal databases, and not just for sex offenders, but for any other types of criminal activity. The reason that's so important, if a child suffers harm, your church is going to face liability. And if you're not very comprehensive with your efforts, that liability is going to increase. And we saw a case out of California a few years ago where a youth soccer organization was found liable because it did not run criminal background checks on its employees and volunteers. There was a child harmed and they faced significant liability. And we think it was probably the first case in the country that sort of recognized a legal duty for organizations that work with kids to perform criminal background checks. And we could see that logic being applied anywhere from this point forward.
No, I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because I also take the position that this is not merely a best practice. This is a need to do. This is a necessary component. So answering your question, should we do background checks for all volunteers or just those who work with children? The answer is unequivocally all volunteers, because all volunteers have presumably the opportunity to interact with children, so long as your church includes children, which we pray that it does, right? I also want to mention, yes, that age of majority is what we are considering to be children. And most jurisdictions, as Matt has said, that's 18. There are some jurisdictions that age is 21. So you want to be aware of what that age of majority is for your jurisdiction, where your church is operating or where you are having activities. And just by way of an example, I was speaking with a church last week, and they received a demand letter from an attorney that represents an individual who alleges abuse in 1972. And they asked me, the first question was, can they do this, like, from 1972? And the reality, you'll know where I'm going with this, Matt, is that so many jurisdictions, including the jurisdiction where this church is located, has lifted, i.e. removed, any statute of limitations. So even if the claim was back to 1972, courts have now said that these can move forward. So we've got a whole lot more questions to cover, so I won't belabor the point on that. But as you have, I think, aptly said, if you don't take anything else away from this discussion, and you will, but I want you to take away the fact that you must have a child protection policy in place that adequately indicates the necessary background checks for all volunteers. All right. So thanks so much, Matthew, for your feedback on that one. Let's go to question 2. So a listener asked, a church in our area is closing and wants to give our church the empty building and assets. No strings attached. Well, blessings to you all. The question is, what legal issues should we be considering? I'll take a stab at it and then Matt, fill in any gaps, if you will.
Great.
So, first of all, I love the fact that this local church is thinking about their neighbors as they are closing. We know that statistically, unfortunately, there is a significant number of church closures. That number continues to increase from the data that we're seeing. So I think it is very wise that the church is making a plan for its assets. So you said the empty building and the assets, and I'm glad that you made that distinction. While a building is an asset, it's not all of the assets. So I want to just address both kinds of assets, real estate as well as non-real estate. As relates to real estate, you want to make sure that you do still get a title search, right? If you were purchasing property, you would generally be required before you could get title insurance to have a title search. But I would still say, even though you're receiving this property, from what I can tell, at no cost or for free, you still want to do a title search to see if there are any liens or if there are any considerations around other attachments to the property. And you want to go ahead and maybe have someone do an inspection so that you can just know the nature of the asset that you're receiving. An inspection often includes the roof, it includes plumbing. You want to have just a detailed knowledge of this property that you're receiving, because free doesn't always mean that there won't be a cost to your church. And you want to make sure that you can adequately meet any of those costs should the building have some of those needs. Now, as relates to other assets, that might include bank accounts, that may include other things that are in the property, right? Like pews, and that maybe the church has a van. You want to make sure that there's a documented list of all the assets that are being transferred. When there is a church dissolution, which is what we call legally a closing, when there's a dissolution, the law requires that all of the assets be transferred to another tax exempt organization, which another church presumably would be. So, without going into further details, I think that we've sort of hit the peaks here. I love this idea. I love that the church that is closing is making this plan. Because you are moving from one church to another, I think that you would likely meet that dissolution requirement. I would document and I would still inspect each of the assets being transferred so that you know that what you're receiving, and if there are any maybe repairs that may be necessary, you'll be prepared for that. Any thoughts you want to share there, Matthew?
Ricky, you've hit the key highlights there, and you're exactly right as far as that separation between real property, which is the building and land, and then the personal property. A couple of quick comments on both fronts. One, on the real property side, we really highly encourage churches that are receiving that property, and this is true even in a sale, right? But also, especially in this scenario with a gift, that they have an environmental site assessment performed. And the reason is because if there's any contamination on the property of any kind that later affects a neighboring property, your church can be liable for that contamination of that neighboring property. And we have seen that kind of scenario play out a couple of different times and have covered it through some of our articles on our site. So just, highly encourage you to do an environmental site assessment with any kind of real property that you're obtaining. The other piece here with the personal property that we'll just note, you're exactly right. You want a full detailed list, and you really want the giving church to have an officer who represents that all of that dissolving church's debts have been paid prior to making those donation of assets over to your church. And it just helps establish those proper procedures if there's ever an issue later, especially if there's like creditors who surface from that dissolving church saying, hey, we're still owed money, because now you've received those assets, you might be looking at having to deal with those creditors.
I love it. Thanks for adding those additional points. Again, thank you so much, listeners, for these excellent questions. We're going to go on to the next one from another listener that asked regarding love offerings for pastor appreciation. Are we allowed to have the congregation and visitors donate to the pastor's individual Zelle, Cash App, or mail checks directly to him. Matt, I feel like no matter what the topic is, when I am speaking with churches, I was just down in Florida speaking at a conference, actually over this past week. And my topic was really talking about top compliance issues for churches, but inevitably the issue around pastoral offerings, or what we call love gifts, right? But I'm pointing to my book over here if people are watching on the YouTube channel. But it's a question that comes up all the time, and I think it's become even more complicated post COVID, because maybe churches that didn't have a way of receiving offerings outside of in-person contributions got set up maybe on Cash App, or Zelle, as they're mentioning here. And as I have shared, those are not ideal scenarios for giving in church. And often when you're dealing with past, what we call love offerings, right? That raises a whole other issue. So I'll let you, do you want me to take that one?
No,
If
I can dive
okay.
in, but I
Okay,
mean
we'll just
jump
dive in.
into. I mean, you're on the front lines. You see and encounter these things. I know one of the things for us, we have a great book that CPA Elaine Somerville has written called Church Compensation, second edition, and it's actually just been recently updated with new 2025 information. So it's really great timing here as far as us talking about this right now. Um, the challenge with these kinds of scenarios when a donor wants to give directly to a minister, right? And it's sort of like this, hey, I just want to give this as a gift. I don't want it to create, any kind of tax, any taxable income for the minister or anything like that. And it gets into some really gray areas that can get kind of difficult, as you've already identified. First and foremost, if that happens, if a donor does that with a minister, that donor is not going to get the tax deduction. It's not a charitable contribution. Okay. So donor needs to understand that right out of the gate. If they're still looking for that ability to deduct this for charitable giving purposes, then they need to go through the church in order to do that. Now, I know current tax law makes it hard to itemize right now, and we'll wait and see what tax reform happens here in 2025. So that may change. And if it does, then that becomes more relevant again for donors. But just at a high level, it's just not going to be deductible. The bigger question is what happens for the minister? Is it income? Is it taxable? And there's some disagreement within the profession about it. It requires a high bar to be met to say, yes, this is truly a gift. It's detached. It's just disinterested generosity is the term, that's just arising out of affection and admiration. That's a high bar. Like, how does the donor really truly indicate, yeah, I'm giving this for no other reason but just those reasons, and not because the minister has done anything in the course of their work as a minister that I've benefited from? So Elaine's conclusion, and I think many professionals would agree, even though that comes from the donor directly to the minister, that minister is still going to need to report that as taxable income. There are some who might say otherwise, but you want to be very sure you've got good counsel and good documentation to demonstrate why you've reached that conclusion, because it will potentially catch the eye of the IRS later.
Yeah, I will say, I love that you sort of hit on what I call this three-legged stool when it comes to the question of love offerings, right? So you've got the donor, which is referenced, you've got the recipient, the pastor, and you also have the church. So this three-legged stool, and they each of the parties, each of these individuals have responsibilities under the law. And I'm going to read directly from the Church Attorney's Guide on Love Offerings, and I'll drop that link in the show note as well. And I come to the same conclusion as Elaine, just so you know. So I first talk about what is a love offering, and it's commonplace when discussing this important topic. And we often see that as relates to the term love offering, there is no one accepted definition. You can ask a dozen people and you'll get a dozen different answers, which is sort of what you were suggesting, Matt. But moreover, and perhaps most notably, the IRS does not specifically define the term. Let me skip to this part. The legal ramifications of how we address love offerings are very important. It's not only controversial and confusing, the topic, but from a legal perspective, it's one of the most highly prosecuted areas for churches and pastors. In short, while the term love offering may imply that what is given is a non-taxable gift, most often it is determined by the IRS to be taxable income. So we want to be careful how we designate that gift, quote unquote. And we also want to be careful about how it's given. Rather than Zelle, rather than Cash App, rather than something going to the pastor's personal home, ideally, this would be a process that the church supports and undertakes where there's maybe received contributions to the pastor, maybe celebrating an anniversary or something to that effect. And it's managed all the way through from receipt of the love offerings or receipt of the donations to the documentation of such. So that I think would be the ideal way to move forward. Thanks again for the insights on that and all the conclusions there. All right, we've got a lot of questions and a little time, so I'm going to try to keep it keep it moving here.
Good.
The next question is: we collect a charge from third parties that want to use our church space. Are we at risk of jeopardizing our 501c3 status? Is there any guidance on how to generate other income without jeopardizing our status? So, first of all, again, I love this question. Thank you, listener, for sending this in. I'm going to just start with that second part of the question, which is there any guidance on how to generate other income without jeopardizing our status? In fact, we have an entire episode dedicated to that topic because we recognize that, especially in today's time, churches are looking for other ways to increase their income that's outside of giving alone. And using your number one asset often, which is your property, could be a strong way of doing that. So I'm going to include an episode that I had with Majette Parker, who is also a church law and tax editor, contributor, along with myself and obviously the organization that Matt represents, and also an attorney who manages property matters. So I'm going to drop that episode in the show notes as well. But there are other ways of generating income. I just want to point out that all of those ways may not be tax exempt. And I want churches to consider that, and that could be okay. I work with a number of churches that have made the decision to have income generating activities, and they recognize that it's a taxable event, and the balance of receiving the significant revenue is outweighed by paying the taxable sum. So I just, first of all, want people to consider the fact that not every event has to be a tax exempt event, and don't shy away from a process but go through it in a strategic way of receiving those incomes. So I've had everything from churches that have had billboards or on top of their church because they're near a major highway, or maybe more recently even receive like solar panels or other kinds of things where they are receiving income. Even I have a church that I love this concept. They have a way that people can do their laundry. So they literally created like a laundromat. And that's both a witnessing tool for them because people come in and it's a great way to connect. But not everything necessarily is going to be tax exempt. And long as you go through the strategic and financial component of examining this, it still could be positive. Another thing is plug-in vehicles, charging stations. A lot of churches are getting into making use of those things. There are lots of different ways it can be done as you consider what options may be best for your church. Anything you want to add to that, Matt?
You've hit a lot of the key points here, Erika, and I think oftentimes we see this come up most in the context of renting out space to an outside group, renting out a parking lot, or maybe selling goods. Like there's a church merchandise kind of function, or a bookstore, or a coffee shop. Some of those types of scenarios. And like you said, like this is this is ministry at its best, I think. It's finding ways to serve and meet needs in your community within the church, as well as the surrounding community around the church, and utilizing a visible piece of your church's assets in the building and the accessibility to it from the local community is a really great way of sort of maximizing what you have for ministry purposes. I think the bottom line is, and you're exactly right, it's going to generate some tax, and there's some rules around that, and we have some articles that cover this topic as well, that kind of help you understand how that works, and then how you go through the process of paying it. But just because tax is associated with it doesn't make it bad. It just, like you were pointing out, it's just part of the cost of doing business. And there's also the intangible benefit, which is the ministry element. Like what is accomplished through this from a ministry standpoint that we can't really quantify. It's more qualitative and yet so valuable for the church's mission ultimately. So the rules I'll just sort of note here, it's sort of like a trade or a business. It's regularly carried on in some way, and that ultimately it's really not substantially related to the church's exempt purposes. When you understand those three factors, that's what will help you understand, okay, this activity may be generating some tax that we have to account for. Now, renting property moves into some territory that could be, there's some special rules. Like if the property is debt financed, then it's going to have tax implications. If the property is paid off, it may not. But again, you're going to want to navigate those kinds of rules carefully, probably consult with property tax experts, tax attorneys, or CPAs who are familiar with this area, just to give you a better sense of what is going on. The one other last thing I'll mention very quickly, if you rent out your property, and this is really true with churches that use the opportunity to open up their sanctuary for, let's say, a wedding in their community. So it's people that can come in and use the space, but they may not necessarily attend the church or be members of the church. If you do that, one of the things that we've been watching closely is that oftentimes a local municipality will have public accommodations laws that dictate how that kind of activity is carried on and who is, permitted or not permitted to, pay to use that space. And for churches, especially those on the more conservative end of the spectrum, theologically and politically, they may have certain people that they feel great about having come in and use their space, or they may have situations that they're not as comfortable with from a theological standpoint. And consequently, they have to understand the tension they may face if they are receiving income for people to come and use that space. They may be subject to those public accommodations laws, which say, hey, you can't be discriminatory as far as who is using your space. So just a caution on that front, a little bit of a side issue to unrelated business income, but still very much related and relevant.
That's for sure. I know that one of the strong pieces of information we share is having a facilities use agreement, making sure that you document if someone else is using your space, and considering insurance as well as an additional insurance. So there are lots of other considerations, but we hope that this has given you a good start. Thanks for that question. Well, we're going to have to land the plane shortly. I think that we're only probably going to be able to get through maybe one or two more questions, but we really appreciate you as listeners sharing your questions with us, and we're glad that we've been able to get through as many as we have. All right. So another question that you sent in is, what's the best way to protect your church's name? In New York City, a church is registered on the county level. How can we avoid another organization using the name and registering it on the state level? Do you want to take a stab at that, Matt?
Yes. And again, great question. And we see this has really become a frequent question in the last, I'd say 15, 20 years, because I think we've just seen culturally and societally sort of this recognition of the value of brand and the power of names and associations. And so, with legal protections oftentimes tied to those things, we've seen churches become much more aware and curious about what they should or shouldn't be doing on this front. We have a great article on our site by attorney Nathan Adams, who, talks about church trademarks and what's sort of like the rationale or reason for it, and why it's maybe a good idea. It might feel somewhat foreign or even a little bit intimidating for some churches or church leaders, and understandably so. But really, what he sort of advances and what we would say is true is that, sometimes your church's name, is associated with certain doctrinal, liturgical, or worship distinctives that make it very unique and valuable. And you want to make sure that someone else doesn't come in and use the same name in a way in your area that might run contrary to those doctrinal, liturgical, or worship distinctives, right? Because that can become confusing for people in your community. Well, wait a minute, are you this church that believes this or this church that believes that? And if it's the same name, now there's like this, tension that naturally forms. So, seeking out these kinds of protections are a good idea. I don't, I will just sort of run through very quickly what is required to get a protection, legally speaking. And it comes down to these factors. One is it should be distinctive, really, makes it very clear that this is a very unique name, that it's not in conflict with another existing mark. So somebody else hasn't already gone out and gotten a protection and you're trying to come in now and encroach on that. And that you're using it in the ordinary course of trade or business, which for a church is really just, it's day-to-day operations, what it's doing. And so two other kind of quick things. One, you can go register that trademark. You can do so at your state level as well as nationally through the USPTO office. You can also just simply say, hey, we haven't gone and registered it, that little R symbol that comes after the brand name, but we still believe we have rights and protections with it. So we'll put the TM symbol behind it just to say, hey, we believe we have rights and we'll defend them, even though we haven't necessarily gone out and done the official registration processes. Now, obviously, there's advantages to getting officially registered. It gives you maybe more leverage, more protections. But, either way, you can sort of do that to try and give yourself at least the ability to tell the public at large, hey, we believe our name is really unique and valuable. One last item I'll just mention, and then Erika, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Your protections are really going to be very geographically specific. So you might be, Christ Community Fellowship in a certain area, and it's pretty unreasonable to think you can get that trademark and protect it against any other church in the country that's going to use that same name, right? It's just really going to be more specific to your kind of local geographical context where you'll have maybe a little bit more of an ability to defend yourself than if, let's say, a church 3 states over uses that same name. Most are going to agree. Who's going to get confused by the duplication? It's really, not going to, create that kind of uncertainty in that community where you're located.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that I'm going to reach out to Nathan so that we can have a whole entire discussion on this because we really could dedicate, I think, an entire episode.
Yes.
To your question, I think the distinctions about how broad the protection is based on whether we're talking about a trade name, which sounds like what this initially was talking about, versus a trademark, which I think you highlighted pretty specifically. So a trade name is, I always say that it's pretty cheap to get on the state level, and it's pretty narrow as it relates to its protections. It doesn't offer a lot, and you don't pay a whole lot to get it, right? It definitely is an example of sort of you get what you pay for, but it does allow you to generally hold that name in that particular jurisdiction. Now, that's different from a trademark, which is registered on the federal level and requires quite a more extensive process to procure, and it is a good bit more expensive, and it's probably something that you need to ensure that an attorney is handling for you. So the church attorney, for example, is a registered trademark, and that's important because it means that no one else has the legal authority to make use of that mark. And so you see that registration, as Matt has referenced. The I would be cautious to use the trademark reference, that's that TM symbol that Matt mentioned, unless you have done your due diligence to know that, in fact, you're not infringing on someone else's mark in doing so. So I think it's a really, it's a splendid question that you've asked. So look for an upcoming episode, because I do want to dive into this more. We only have time to take one final question, and we'll need to nail it in about 2 minutes or so. So listen up. We'll talk more about this copyright when it comes to churches' names, because we haven't even gotten into like the other images, right? Not just the words, but how you present it overall. So listen up. You're inspiring us to go deeper into that topic. So last question, Matt, here we are. How does the church adequately separate duties and responsibilities to add proper checks and balances to avoid conflicts of interest, financial loss, and reputational loss? I love this question. Okay, how does the church adequately separate duties and responsibilities to add proper checks and balances? So I'll start us off. You say to avoid conflicts of interest. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in asking the question. The answer is kind of hidden in there, and that is having a conflicts of interest policy. The IRS presumes, and it is definitely a matter of best practices, that every tax exempt organization, including churches, has adopted a conflicts of interest policy. A conflicts of interest policy, by definition, is going to establish three things. Number one, it's going to help your governing board be able to identify a conflict. When does a conflict occur? How do we identify a conflict? Secondly, it's going to give you some instructions about what to do if a conflict arises. And thirdly, it will help you know how to handle any conflicts should they arise. So it's really important to have that conflict of interest policy, that it's been adopted by the church, and ultimately that you also have each person on the board sign an attestation each year that they don't have a conflict in their service. And these conflicts really are talking about financial matters. So if a conflict came up, it would be the duty of any member of the board to identify, to make the rest of the board aware of this conflict, and then the board would handle it appropriately. As it relates to your question about adequately separating duties and responsibilities, I'm going to have to go back to a policy again. I really want to see every church ideally have a financial policy in place. So the financial policy is going to help you know how to manage all revenue, right? Who has authority to actually sign off on checks. And again, ideally, there are two people signing any checks. Who has the responsibility and the duty to receive income, to deposit that income, and to pay any expenses on behalf of the church. And the proper checks and balances includes making sure that they're not conflicts, right? So it shouldn't be husband and wives serving together, or other relatives serving together, brother, sister, mother, father, etc. And so that's a part of making sure that we separate these duties and responsibilities so that they are proper checks and balances. Matt, you want to add to that?
No, you've hit all of the kind of the key themes there, key topics. I think, especially on the financial side of things, we had a survey a few years ago nationwide, and about a third of the churches we talked to said that they had experienced some form of financial misconduct in their histories. And it just sort of reinforced the fact that this issue is real, and it does affect churches day in and day out. And that's where these best practices that you've described, Erika, are so important. That segregation of duties, making sure you've got two people involved on anything on the revenue side, and then anything that's going, back out. So whether it's counting collections or it's signing checks and making payments, you've got two people involved really at all turns. And then, like you said, that they're unrelated, they're not, connected in some way where they could be, actually colluding in their efforts together. The one other kind of piece to this that I'll mention, our survey showed that most of the time the perpetrator was someone who had served in the church's financial operations for many years. They were just really trusted. People just sort of just thought of them as, not, somebody that would do something of this nature. And the biggest red flag that would tip off this type of person doing something inappropriate was that they would just not relinquish control over financial information or processes. They were constantly guarding that, kind of keeping that close. They wouldn't take vacations, or they would be very closed about who could access information when they were gone. And it was because they were obviously hiding the activity that they were engaging in. So removing that opportunity, having two people involved at every turn, really minimizes that kind of dynamic, and in a way that we think ultimately can just prevent this overall. So we have a great training program with Vana Lau, CPA, who's on our advisory board, called Safeguarding Your Church's Finances. And it gives sort of like the step-by-step on how to set all of that up, and highly encourage it for those that may be listening and haven't really looked at this issue.
And I'll say that Vana actually joined us for an earlier podcast episode, and we will drop that in the show notes as well. And so, as we wrap up, Matt, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I know that listeners appreciate having them, and will benefit greatly from this whole Q&A session. I really enjoyed it. And to our listeners, I want to say thank you for tuning in. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your church leaders and fellow ministry workers. And if you have any legal or tax questions you'd like for us to address in a future episode, send them our way, and you may hear it in an upcoming episode. We appreciate you. Blessings on your service, and thanks for listening.